Our story tonight is the Deathless Koschei. It's an ancient tale from the heartland of Eurasia. And Erik Mollenhauer is our storyteller. He came across this story, he said, about a decade ago. And he was fascinated by it. He was haunted by it, he said. And he's felt compelled not only to know the story himself, but to share it with a much wider audience. And he'll tell you how he's doing that tonight, and the paintings there are involved in that sharing of this marvelous story. So without further verbiage from me, I want to give welcome to Erik Mollenhauer, our teller of tales tonight, and the death of Koschei the Deathless.
Thanks, Rich. Let's light the campfire with a match. So, as Rich said, there are 4 paintings over there. If you didn't see them yet, be sure to check them out afterwards. They're exquisite. They're done by an artist in the Delaware Water Gap, Marie Liu, who paints in oils. And I commissioned her, or we agreed for her to do 15 color oil paintings. There will be illustrations in a book that I think will be published and available by March. It's been a long process, 2 years of working with Marie. She also did some black and white sketches. They'll be in the book. But the book right now is in the process of being formatted and getting ready, a copy ready for print, which hopefully that'll be ready for print sometime in early January, and then I don't know how long the printer will take. But I have had the good fortune of having a foundation in Connecticut that I've worked with over the years, and they believe in this book and the project, and so they're putting money behind it. As Rich said, I first came across this about 10 years ago. The title is The Death of Koschei the Deathless. In the beginning, I just read it as like another story. And then I kept coming back to it, and it kept sort of speaking to me. And honestly, over the last 10 years, as I've read it and reread it and reimagined it, I guess you would say, I've come to believe, number one, this was a story that was created by an indigenous culture in Central Asia. And they were astute observers of human behavior. They understood what humans like you and I deal with as we move through our lives. They also were cheek to jowl with nature and animals. They were a horse culture. And I think I'll stop there and start the story. Long ago, in a forested area of the mountains of the gods, lived an old man and an old woman. They had 4 children, 1 boy named Mergen, and 3 sisters, or 3 daughters. They were sisters of Mergen. The old man and the old woman knew that their time was coming to an end. And so they said to Mergen one day, Mergen, take care of your sisters and be sure they get married, because they and you have been slow off the mark in that regard. Time passed, the mother and father passed away. Now it was just Mergen and his 3 sisters. One day they were walking through the forest not far from the lodge where they lived, and they could see in the distance dark clouds forming, and they were forming very quickly and moving towards them, very big, billowing dark clouds. They ran as fast as they could for the lodge where they lived. But before they got there, just as they got near, streaking out of the clouds like an arrow came a falcon. The falcon landed very close to where they were, and as its feet touched the ground, it transformed into a handsome young man, a falcon prince, who turned to Mergen and said, Mergen, I'd like to marry your oldest sister. What a fine idea, they decided. And so it was done. And his oldest sister went to live in the land of the Falcon Prince. Within a few days, they were out walking again, Mergen and his two sisters, and then again, dark clouds. A storm came, chased them back to the lodge, and just before it hit, streaking out of the clouds came an eagle who landed in front of them, turned into a handsome prince, and said, Mergen, I'd like to marry your middle sister. Another fine idea. And so it was done. And she went to live with him in the land of the eagle. As you can imagine, a few days later, another storm, another bird shooting out of the clouds, but this time the bird was cartwheeling in somersaults. And when the raven touched the ground, it turned into a handsome prince who said, Mergen, I'd like to marry your youngest sister. And so it was done. And she and he went to live in the land of the raven. Now, some weeks went by, and Mergen was feeling rather lonely because he hadn't lived there in the lodge by himself before. So he mounted his horse and decided to ride off and visit his kin. He went through the mountains, through the forest, down into the lowlands, and passed into lands beyond his understanding. And not able to see very well, he rode his horse up to the top of a hill so he could see better what was coming before him. And to his shock and surprise, down below, the forest had been mowed down, trees tossed in every direction, splintered, hardly any green leaves in this track of destruction, and no birds sang. The track of destruction went up and over the hills, and in the distance he could see the ocean, and at the cliffs at the edge of the ocean there was a tent with gaily colored banners flying, but nobody around that he could see. He rode along the track of destruction until he got to near the tent, and as he approached the tent, a lovely young woman in very beautiful clothing stepped from the tent and said, Welcome, young prince. Do you come here out of choice, or do you come out of compulsion? I have to just stop 1 second. As I tell the story, if you hear anything that you think is important, because I will tell you, embedded in this story are a lot of messages from the original storytellers. If you find something you think is important, hopefully you have a pen and a piece of paper. Just jot a few words down. We'll talk about it afterwards. She stepped from the tent. Welcome, young prince. Do you come here out of choice, or do you come out of compulsion? Mergen, sitting on his horse, pushed his chest out and said, No brave man comes out of compulsion. I come here out of choice. Fair enough, she said. Join me in my tent for food and relaxation. Mergen was in that tent for 3 days and 3 nights. What happened during that time, we may only imagine. But afterwards, they decided to go as husband and wife and live in her lodge by the sea. Her name was Moravna. Moravna, the daughter of the sea is how that translates. She lived in a lodge by the sea. So they went to live in her lodge by the sea. And after some time, Moravna said to him, Mergen, I have to go away for a few days. You have complete use of everything in my lodge, but there is one room you may not go into, you must not go into, no matter what. By the way, the key is over there on the wall, but you must not. Well, she left. And it just kept chewing away at him. And finally he thought, what can it hurt? So he got the key from the wall, turned it in the door, opened the door, creak on the hinges. It was dark in that room. a little bit of sunlight came from a window up on the wall, high up on the wall, just a small window with bars, no glass, just bars. So a little bit of fresh air came in and a little bit of light came in, but it was dark. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he could see on the floor a giant of a man, probably 8 feet tall and rather skeletal, emaciated, hair that hung in all directions like seaweed, and eyes that were reptilian and hardly blinked at all. The man looked at Mergen and said, "Have pity. Have pity. I've lain here for endless days, weeks. I need water. I need to drink." Feeling pity, Mergen went from the room, got a bucket, filled it with water, brought it back, and took it over to the man who held it up. He was chained with a dozen different chains, but he was able to hold it up, and he drank it down, the whole bucket of water, and said, "I need more water." Mergen went, got a second bucket, brought it back. He drank the whole second bucket. Mergen went, got a third bucket, brought it back. He drank the third bucket. And then, as if the chains were made of paper, he pulled them from the floor and stood up. And gathering his strength, he said, "It was Moravna who chained me here. I will go now, and you'll never see Moravna again." And at that, he stood and began to spin in a circle. And as he spun faster and faster, he brought his arms in like a skater. And he spun so fast that like a skater, you could hardly see him spinning. And then he spun right out through the bars of that window into the space beyond. And Mergen could see this whirlwind with the vague form of the giant inside, as it spun across the fields, gathering up dust, gathering up leaves, gathering sticks, and then went crashing through the forest and disappeared. What had he done? Mergen was horrified. He had to do something to rescue Moravna. So he saddled his horse, and he followed the track of the whirlwind as it had gone through the forest, breaking a twig here and a twig there. He went for a day, a second day, and finally, the third day, he came to a lodge in the forest. Near the lodge was a giant oak tree. In the oak tree was a falcon who flew down at his feet, turned into a handsome prince who said, "Welcome, kinsman. Join your sister and I for some food and conversation." And so Mergen joined them. And he asked questions about this giant of a man. And the falcon prince said, "That was Koschei. He's a hunter. He's always out there hunting, and he's very, very dangerous." "No matter," said Mergen. "I caused this to happen. I must rescue Moravna." "All right," said the falcon prince, "but leave us your silver spoon so we can remember you." Mergen went off. And after another day, he came to a second lodge, another large oak tree. In the tree, an eagle who landed at his feet and said, "Welcome, kinsman. Join your sister and I for some food and conversation." And now Mergen learned that Koschei was not only a hunter and very dangerous, but one of the reasons why he was very dangerous is because he had a talking horse. And not just any horse, but a horse of power. And Koschei liked to ride his horse when he went hunting completely naked. Picture that, if you will. An 8-foot giant riding a horse completely naked. Well, he must be a madman. No matter, said Mergen. I must find and rescue Moravna. Well, said his eagle kin, if you must do that, leave us your silver fork so we can remember you. He went off, and after another day, he came to another lodge, another oak tree. In the oak tree was a raven who landed on the ground, became the raven prince. Welcome, kinsman, join your sister and I. And this time he learned that Koschei was so dangerous because he could not be killed. He was deathless. No matter, said Mergen, I must go anyway. Well, said the raven prince, leave us your silver knife so we can remember you. And off he went. After some more days, he finally came to Koschei's great lodge. And as luck would have it, Koschei was off hunting. He found Moravna and said, Moravna, jump on the horse. We will go away quickly. And so they did. And just as they rode away, Koschei, who was riding his horse stumbled at that very moment. What is it? Great steed? What mischief is abroad? Mergen has come and taken Moravna. What? Do we have time to get them? We would have time to plant a field of wheat, let it grow, harvest it, grind it up, make flour, bake bread, eat the bread. Even then, there would be time. Let's go, said Koschei. And that horse was so fast, in no time at all, they caught up with Mergen. Koschei took his arm and slammed it, knocking Mergen off the horse. He lay on the ground, dazed. Koschei stood over him and said, this time I let you live. Maybe even a second time, but the third time is sure death. And then he rode off in a blur. Mergen picked himself up off the ground and followed Koschei's tracks back to the great lodge, which was some distance away. And by the time he got there, Koschei was off hunting because he spent much of his time hunting. He said to Moravna, jump on the horse, we have to get away now. Mergen, this is foolish, she said. Nevertheless, we must try. She got on the horse, they rode off. It was at that very moment that they rode off that Koschei's horse stumbled, and Koschei said, old bag of bones, is some mischief abroad? Yes. Mergen has come and taken Moravna again. What? Do we have time to get them? To catch them? We could plant a field of barley, harvest it, brew it into beer, drink ourselves drunk, and still there would be time. Let's go, said Koschei. He rode off and quickly came to where Mergen was. This time Koschei knocked him from the horse, kicked him on the ground, beat him with his fist till he was bloody, and then took Moravna and left on his way back to his great lodge. It took Mergen a few days to recover from that scene, but once he felt he was back in condition, he got on his horse and again went to Koschei's great lodge, and as it can guess, Koschei was away hunting. Moravna, we must go, she said, you will die. I must try. She got on the horse, they rode off. At that very moment, Koschei's horse stumbled. He's got her again. What? This time, Koschei was a raging storm. He took his long curving sword and whirled it around like this, and it hissed. He was whirling it so fast, it was hissing. He raced back to where Mergen was, and this time knocked Mergen off the horse, and with his sword cut him into many pieces. Then he took the dismembered parts of Mergen, put them into a barrel, closed the barrel with steel bands, tarred it, took it to the edge of the cliffs near the sea, and threw it into the sea. The barrel drifted away towards the horizon and then disappeared. Then he took Moravna back to his great lodge. It was about that time that the silver spoon, silver fork, and silver knife began to darken, began to tarnish. And the eagle, the falcon, the raven said to themselves, something evil has happened. They flew off in 3 different directions. The falcon flew towards the sunrise. The raven flew towards the sunset. The eagle flew out over the ocean and began to make larger and larger circles in a search pattern to try to find the barrel. At last he found it. He flew down, and the eagle began pushing the barrel towards a shoreline that he could see getting larger in the distance. He pushed it all the way to the shoreline and up onto the sandy beach, and then waited. From the direction of the sunrise came the falcon, carrying a blue vial with some liquid in it. From the direction of the sunset came the raven with another blue vial with some liquid in it. The 3 kin of raven got together on the beach. They opened the barrel and laid the dismembered parts of Mergen into their proper order. Once the dismembered parts were placed in their proper order, the raven opened the blue vial and sprinkled the water of death onto the dismembered parts. The dismembered parts came back together and fused, but Mergen remained lifeless. Then the falcon opened the blue vial which contained the waters of life and sprinkled it on the remembered parts of Mergen. And with a start, Mergen came back to life. He looked around at his kin and said, "Have I been asleep for a very long time?" And they said, "You would have been asleep for a much longer time if we had not remembered you." And then they said, "Mergen, if you must do battle with Koschei, you must be on equal terms. You must have a horse of power. And to get that horse of power, you have to do business with a witch whose name is Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga. They explained some more things to him. And then they said, but you need to go back to Koschei's lodge because you're going to need a magic handkerchief. And you need some information that only Koschei has. You'll need to enlist Moravna in getting that information. So he went back to Koschei's lodge, and as you no doubt have already guessed, Koschei was away hunting because he spends most of his time hunting. And Mergen said, Moravna, ask Koschei tonight how he got his horse of power. And so she did. Mergen hid in the nearby forest. She asked. Oh, said Koschei, I got my horse of power from Baba Yaga. She lives in a land that's 3 times 9 lands from here, across the river of fire. I was her herdsman for 3 days. And during those 3 days, I took care of all of her horses. She has one horse that is so fast it can fly around the world in one night. And that mare gives rise to all the other horses, the horses of power. Well, said Moravna, how did you get across the river of fire? Oh, he reached for a handkerchief that was sitting on a table. This handkerchief, which had some unusual designs on it, this handkerchief, it's a magic handkerchief. When you come to the river of fire, if you wave it 3 times right, a crystal bridge will appear over the fire and you can cross on the crystal bridge. If you wave it 3 times left, the crystal bridge disappears and a rickety wooden bridge is in place of it. Oh, okay. And so that night, Moravna took the magic handkerchief, gave it to Mergen, explained to him that he needed to go through 3 times 9 lands and cross the river of fire, and then he would come to the place where Baba Yaga lived. He started his journey on his horse. He went through the 3 times 9 lands. He came to the river of fire. He waved the handkerchief, and sure enough, the crystal bridge occurred, and he went over and onto the other side and continued on through the forest. As he went through the forest, he came to a mother bird with a nest of some eggs and some young chicks, and he was feeling really hungry by now. He'd been traveling without any food and just picking up whatever he could find. He was getting ready to grab those eggs and grab those young chicks and eat them, but the mother bird pleaded with him and said, Mergen, don't eat my babies, don't eat my young. If you don't do that now, we will help you sometime when you need help. Okay, he said. He continued on. He came to a wildcat. The wildcat had 2 young kits. He was so hungry he was going to kill and eat the kits, and the wildcat said, don't eat my kits, Mergen, someday we will help you. And so he continued on. He came to a hollow tree where there were bees that came out of the tree. Obviously there was honey inside. He was so hungry, but the queen bee said, don't eat our honey, we need it for the winter. If you don't, we will help you sometime when you need it. Okay, he was so hungry, but he continued on. And as he went through the forest, the daylight was fading. It was getting dark, much like this. And he came into a clearing, much like this is a clearing. And as he looked to the far edge of the clearing, there was a strange kind of hut. It was like a small building with a door and a couple of steps going down to the ground and 2 windows and a roof. But the strange thing about this building was it was supported by 2 big chicken legs. And as he watched, the hut kind of danced around a little bit. Every now and then, those chicken legs were moving around. And the hut was kind of tilting this way and tilting that way. But what really caught his attention was at the edge of the clearing, there were 12 posts arranged in more or less a circle like this that we're sitting in now. And each one of those posts had a human skull on the top of it. And with the way the light was fading, it almost seemed like the eye sockets were glowing. But he noticed that there was one post that did not have a skull on it. And he had an uneasy feeling who that last post might be for. And just as that thought came to mind, the door opened and out stepped this old woman, Baba Yaga, who said, "Welcome, Mergen." Oh, he had been expected. "Welcome, Mergen. Do you come here out of choice, or do you come here out of compulsion?" "Forest grandmother," he said, "I come to earn from you a horse of power." She seemed to think that was a little funny. She said, "Well, you won't have to wait too long for that. 3 days. 3 days, you look after my horses, let them out of the stable in the morning, bring them all back at night. Don't lose a single one. If you lose a single one, it will be your head on that post." Fair enough. That night, she fed him very well, gave him a very nice bed to sleep in. He slept reasonably well. I'm not sure if I would, but the next morning, he went to the stables and he let the horses out, and they ran off in all directions into the endless fields that surrounded that area. As much as he could try during the day to get them back, they would just run away from him. And by late in the day, he knew he wasn't going to be successful. He sat down discouraged in the hot sun on a rock and fell asleep. He was wakened just before sunset by something pecking on his shoulder. It was the mother bird. "Mergen, Mergen, wake up! The horses are back in the stable." And sure enough, he went to the stable and all the horses were there, and Baba Yaga was raging. "Why ever did you come back to the stables?" she said. "How could we not?" said the horses. "The birds were pecking at us in all directions. The only safe place to be was in the stables." "Well," said Baba Yaga, "tomorrow, run into the forest. He won't find you there." The next day, he let the horses out. They all ran in different directions into the forest, and as much as he could do, he could not get them back. He was discouraged. At the end of the day, he sat down, fell asleep. He was awakened by something tugging at his shirt. It was the mother wildcat. "Mergen, Mergen, go back to the stables. The horses are in the stables." And Baba Yaga was back there raging. "Why ever did you come back here for? How could we not? The animals were clawing at us. The only safe place to be was back in the stables." "Well, tomorrow," said Baba Yaga, "go into the deep sea." And so the next day, when he let them out, all the horses ran into the deep sea, and the only thing he could see was their noses as they were drinking air, but every other part of the horses was underwater. And as much as he could try wading through the water, he couldn't get them back. He sat down on the beach and fell asleep, was awakened by the bees, who said, "Mergen, Mergen, go back to the stables. The horses are there." And they were. And Baba Yaga was tearing her hair out. "How could you come back? How could we not? The bees were stinging our noses." She said, and she thought to herself, "I'll kill him anyway. I don't care." The bees told Mergen, "Mergen, you must away tonight because Baba Yaga will kill you tomorrow if you don't go tonight. At midnight, wake up, go behind the stables. On the dunghill there, you'll find the sorriest looking colt you've ever seen. It's emaciated and bony and weak. Take that colt with you and go as fast and as far as you can. Mergen did that. They slowly went through the forest. They came to the river of fire. He waved the handkerchief 3 times. Right, the crystal bridge appeared. They went over the crystal bridge and continued on. By dawn, Baba Yaga woke up, and she was raging to find that Mergen was gone. She jumped into her giant mortar and with a giant pestle began to paddle it, to row it, and that thing shot across the ground, shot across the air, and kept on going at lightning speed. She came all the way as fast as she could to the river of fire, and Mergen had shook the handkerchief 3 times left, so the only thing there now was the rickety wooden bridge. She rode her heavy mortar and pestle right up onto the bridge, but the weight of it cracked the wooden bridge. She fell into the river of fire with her mortar and pestle, a puff of ash, and Baba Yaga was seen no more. Mergen continued on through 3 times 9 lands and back to where Koschei's great lodge was. And as you can imagine, Koschei was away hunting. He got Maravna. His horse now was sleek and strong because Mergen had stopped along the way and fed the horse and groomed the horse. His horse of power was sleek and strong. He got Maravna and said, "We must go." And she said, "Mergen, he will surely kill you again, and maybe worse. Where have you been? Where did you get this horse?" He said, "It's a long story." She said, "Yes, Mergen, this is a long story, one that will surely be remembered." Okay, let's go. They got onto the horse and he rode off, and of course it was at that moment that Koschei's horse stumbled. "What is it, old bag of bones?" said Koschei. "Mergen has come again and taken Maravna. Can we catch them?" And his horse replied, "Only the gods know. His horse is as fast as me. His horse is a horse of power." "No," said Koschei, "I won't have it." He got on his horse, swung his sword so quickly that it sang again in a hissing noise, and rode as fast as he could to where Mergen was waiting. Mergen was waiting on a cliff. The waves were rolling in from the ocean and crashing, spewing foam and water high up into the air. As Koschei came, he brought the storm with him. Dark, billowing clouds coming along behind him, a funnel cloud coming down. He rode right up, screaming, raging, with his sword spinning, right up to where Mergen was. Mergen's horse reared back and kicked Koschei directly in the head with one of his front hooves. A large smacking sound when that hoof connected with Koschei's head. Koschei fell to the ground lifeless. Lay there absolutely lifeless. Mergen and Maravna built a fire, a big fire, and threw Koschei's body on it. And as time went by, his body burned with great fury, lesser and lesser, and the ash came up and spread out over the ocean. And finally, the fire burned down low, and just a little flicker of ash was left going back out over the ocean. Victory, it seemed, was theirs. But was Koschei really gone? Who could say? But for now, victory was theirs. Maybe Koschei would be remembered again at some future time in some other place. But for now, victory was theirs. Mergen mounted his horse of power. Moravna mounted Koschei's horse of power. And they rode away from the campfire. The western sky was lit with a fire of itself, a cauldron of reds and purples and oranges and yellows. They would, on the way home, stop at the house, the lodge of the falcon, the eagle, the raven, the kinsman who had remembered him, and give thanks. And there, the story ends. So what I'd like to do, if you're interested, is, let's see if I can do this right. Okay, we'll do that much, I think, is have you share any thoughts that you have about things that you heard in the story that you thought, like, maybe the storytellers were trying to tell us something about, or I wonder what this means, or anything that caught your attention that you would like to share. Anybody?
I was having a little trouble concentrating the whole thing, but was it the bees that told warned Mergen to get the colt away? The dung heap?
Yeah, the bees did. They were the last ones to help him, and they told him, right? Yeah. Other thoughts, comments, like what, when indigenous groups told these stories to their kids, there was a purpose to these stories. There was something they were trying to get across. Any thoughts on that?
Choice and compulsion element showed a choice. His choice was bravery, he said. No mention about what a compulsion might be.
So the first time he's asked that question is by Moravna when he meets her at the tent. Do you come here, young prince, out of choice, or are you compelled to come here? No brave man would come here out of compulsion. I come here because I choose to come here. But he doesn't answer the second time the same way, does he? Because Baba Yaga asks him the same question, and he dodges it by saying, I come here to earn from you a horse of power. What's the difference between those two answers? Why would the storytellers put those two things in there? Could it be because the first time he's this young Turk full of himself? I come here because I want to come here. And the second time he realizes, like, I'm going to have to earn this. And so he's basically saying to Baba Yaga, I come here to earn from you a horse of power. Hopefully, I'm enough of a person to do that. Maybe not, but we'll find out. I think that's a really important thing to notice in the story. Other people, other comments, I'd say there's a lot of different threads running through this story, and that's one of them, Jackie.
I think that, the thread with nature, not destroying it, and you'll be helped at the end. That's it. You'll say so. I got that.
Yeah, do you sort of get the idea in the beginning that Merrigan is saying pretty much like, only I can do this? Like, I'm man enough, I can do this. But then what the storytellers are telling you is he's not man enough to do this by himself. He needs help. And he gets it, among other places, from nature.
But this force of power that both the bad guy and the good guy have, has to be, are we looking at warring factions or how to defeat good and evil? What is that about?
So, okay, so let's if there was evil in this story, who personifies it?
Yes.
Who?
Koschei.
Koschei.
Yeah.
Does Baba Yaga personify evil to some extent?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if those are the personification of evil, I'm using evil in quotation marks, what do they represent? I mean, evil is like a really big word, right? That means a lot, and in some ways it means nothing. What else might they represent? What might Koschei represent? And by the way, there are 4 paintings over there that are going to be in the book, and the first one is Koschei riding naked on his horse, coming right at you out of the painting.
Koschei means the tale of destruction, these whirlwinds around him.
He's tied up.
He was
The
always
force of nature.
referred to as the hunter. So
Yeah.
he was always taking instead of giving, where my name's Mergen would respect it, the other things in nature, and did not destroy them.
So he's a hunter for sure, we know that. He, Shuj, I think you're basically saying he seems to be associated with the whirlwind.
Force of nature.
And force of nature, path of destruction. So we can say he's evil, but he's also associated with nature and powerful forces in nature, and he's a hunter. Anybody else, any comments about him or Baba Yaga or anything else that caught your attention in the story?
Mergen gets a second chance by being put back together whole.
He gets remembered
Yeah,
Which is really interesting.
because he had been dismembered.
Yes.
So a strong thread in this story has to do with memory. When a person dies, what are we left with? We're left with memories. Do the memories stay strong over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Or do they start to fade?
They tarnish.
They tarnish.
Yes.
They tarnish. Leave your silver spoon so we can remember you. We all have artifacts. We all have silver spoons of people who are not with us anymore. And those silver spoons, whether they're photographs or a bureau or a piece of china, are memory prompts so that we can remember that person. We can put them back together in our mind so they don't just drift away and disappear forever. So it's very much, in some ways, a thread runs through the story of memory.
Okay, the weirdest thing I thought was her mortar and pestle is a transportation vehicle.
Yeah. So I don't honestly know how old this story is. I'm not exactly sure of the culture. It's clearly a horse culture, which puts it in Central Europe or Central Asia. oak trees and so on. The eagle is clearly a golden eagle because golden eagles are circumboreal, circumpolar, and they were used for hunting along with falcons, which were used for hunting. So human beings have a long history of using the peregrine falcon. It's probably a peregrine, and the golden eagles for hunting. But the mortar and pestle is interesting because mortars, I can't remember exactly, I have this, it's going to be in the book, but so the book is going to consist of two parts. It's going to be the story with the illustrations, and then it's going to be a large section afterwards that I'm calling the story within the story. And the story within the story will explore some of the things that we are talking about here tonight. And the mortar and pestle, I can't remember, I'm going to say at least 6,000 years, 8,000 years. We have archaeological evidence of mortars and pestles being used for, I think it's at least 6,000 to 8,000 years, if I remember correctly. And they were often used to grind up natural medicines. And it was women who often did that.
Witches.
Well, eventually, they're witches, they need to be burned. But in the beginning, they were healers. And so Baba Yaga kind of occupies this position of she can heal you, because she's in charge of mortar and pestle, or she can kill you. And she probably doesn't care which. Somebody else had a question or comment. Yes?
Yeah, to narrow your story down, it had to happen after the 8th century because forks weren't invented until the 8th century.
What? Say that again?
It had to happen after the 8th century AD.
Because?
Because forks were not invented before the 8th century by the Byzantines.
The horse.
Still work.
Spoons were around for millennia.
What is it?
The fork wasn't invented until the 8th century.
Oh, the fork. Okay.
So if you ignore that, you go back to barrels. Barrels were not invented until the first millennium. So it had to happen after 1 to 1000 AD. So,
Yeah, possibly.
so you're limited to the 8th century.
Yeah, possibly. I will say, like, if you were to Google this story, you'll find that it is a little different than what I told you tonight, because the Russians will tell you, this is our story, and it's about a guy named Ivan, who's the Tsarevich, the young Tsar, and he goes out and has these adventures with this warrior woman, and there's an army, and there's a battlefield, and afterwards, they live happily ever after. That's the Russian version. But I don't believe that, because there's elements in the story that tell me it clearly was originally a story from an indigenous culture. And those elements are things like seeking help from animals, developing relationships with animals, trickster figures. You could make a solid case that Koschei and Baba Yaga are trickster figures. Trickster figures are very much a part of indigenous cultures. Old Man Coyote here in the Southwest, Nana Bojo up around the Great Lakes, the Raven along the West Coast tribes up into Alaska. So, you know, I can't tell you exactly when this happened, but I'm convinced it's an indigenous culture. I'm convinced it's Central Eurasia, and I think it's probably older than what we would guess. Whether the Russians changed some of those things, like the silver spoon, silver fork, so on, you know, like indigenous cultures 10,000 years ago, I don't think they had silver eating utensils. But it makes a good trick in the story about the silver tarnishing. So it's hard to know exactly, but for me, I'm quite comfortable saying this is an indigenous story that the Russians modified, which is typically what happens with stories. Each later culture spins it to their suiting.
Okay, how about the idea of, I saw the the idea of threads that were, that might have turned into other things like the 12 poles and 12 dwarfs, and Snow White and Hansel and Gretel and the witch in the woods and the forest.
Yeah, 12 poles would probably relate somehow to dividing up the year into 12 months. But whether that relates to, you know, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or whatever.
That's a later
Yeah,
corruption
yeah,
of it.
yeah.
How about the 3 times 9 countries there? Did that have?
The 3 what?
3 times 9.
3 times 9.
The only thing I can tell you about that is 3 and multiples of 3, like 9, have always had significance to many different cultures, sometimes spiritually, sometimes just as a story device. You know, when you think about when people tell a joke, it always has to be 3 times before you get to the punchline. And that's because as human beings, we're always looking for patterns. And if something happens once in a joke, and then you tell a punchline, there's no pattern. So it's not predictable, and as human beings, we're always trying to predict where is this going. So 1 is not a pattern, 2 is the beginning of the pattern, 3, oh, it happens 3 times, it's clearly a pattern. And that means this is going to happen probably next. So 3 is a storytelling device, but it's also a pattern-seeking device as human beings. And then 9 is a multiple of 3, so it also has significance. Okay.
And could part of it just be the remembering? Folks did not have a written history, so the way they passed their history down and told their tales and let people know, the generations, what was important was by telling stories, so it was important to remember these stories.
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, like, you know, you're looking for patterns in a story, and certainly as a storyteller, if things repeat, it makes it easier to tell the story. It's interesting, right? When you're doing a joke, you don't tell it 4 times before the punchline. You don't tell it 5 times, because then it becomes too predictable, and it's like, come on, just get to the point. So 3 is like the magic number where the pattern is established, but after that, if you keep doing it, it's boring and you lose people's attention.
No, I meant just like the story itself. The remembering being a big part of the story. Give me the silver spoon to remember you by. Give me this to remember you by.
Right.
So obviously remembering is an important idea throughout the story, you know.
I think it's one of the central themes of the story is the importance of memory, how memory functions. And in today's environment, where I'm a member of the baby boom generation, and you see, you know, like Rosalind Carter, who just passed away, said there are 4 kinds of people in the world: those who needed caregiving, those who need it now, those who will need it, and those who will provide it. And, you know, Alzheimer's and dementia is going to be the epidemic of the next 20 years. It already is, but it's going to get a lot worse because there's so many people of my generation who are going to inevitably get it because it's something that happens with old age. So memory is an interesting thing to deal with. Ravens, take that just for a second. In Norse mythology, you know, Odin, the head of the Norse pantheon, and so on. Odin, according to Norse mythology, had 2 ravens. At dawn, he would send them out into the world to see what was happening. At sunset, they would come back and tell him what's happening out there in the world. He did this every day. According to Norse mythology, Odin worried that a day would come when the 2 ravens would not come back. The ravens' names were Hugin and Munin. Hugin represented thought, Munin represented memory. Even people with Alzheimer's have thoughts, but without memory, it doesn't function. Supposedly, according, again, to Norse mythology, Odin worried that Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, might not return one day. He was most concerned that Munin would not return, that memory would not return, which suggests that even 1,000 years ago or more, there were people that had dementia and Alzheimer's or something like that, because they were familiar with memory not returning, but thought still was there. Huge.
Is there a sequel in which Koschei comes back? It's like a horror movie ending. We know that he's gonna come back.
So that's a really good question. You know, the title of the story, and as I understand the story, I mean, there's other titles than what I'm going to use. But I did see at one point, and I thought, this is what they were talking about. So the title, as far as I'm concerned, whatever the other titles are meaningless. The real title is The Death of Koschei the Deathless. That's essentially a paradox. If it's deathless, it can't be killed. And yet we're saying the death of Koschei the Deathless, which suggests that maybe he will be remembered, put back together. He will be remembered at a future time, a future place. If you look at the last painting, and when I asked the artist to do that last painting, I said, can you do something in the painting to make people a little uneasy? And so if you look at the ash drifting off of the fire and follow the ash, you'll see a face in the ash. And if you look at the cauldron of fire, which is the sunset, you'll see another more feminine face. Baba Yaga's not gone either. So the text won't tell you for sure that they're gone, but if you look at the illustration, it'll make you wonder, are they really gone or do they come back? Can they be killed? Can you kill Baba Yaga? Can you kill Koschei? What is it they represent, really?
Is there another blue bottle that will bring them back?
Maybe they don't need a blue bottle.
The captain and everything.
Yeah.
I liked the part where Koschei was being a hunter, and he was out, and he was hungry, and he kept coming to the birds and the wild cats, and then he came to the bees, you know, and the bees said, "Don't eat our honey.
What sustained them?
We need it. We need it for the winter, for ourselves." And
Yeah, there's a, you all probably know the John Muir quote where he says, one touch of nature makes the whole world kin. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. Indigenous cultures, as far as I've read and understand and know, indigenous cultures saw the birds, the plants, the sky, the rivers, the rocks as kin. In Sioux Lakota belief system, they refer to everything out there as all of our relations. All of our relations. In other words, all of our kinfolk. And what you see developing in the story is that Mergen progressively learns to seek the help and the assistance of other people or other beings, really. Like, you know, are the three princes really human beings? Or are they actually ravens, eagles, and falcons? Or are they something in between? So he's definitely developing a relationship with his wider kin, which I think personally today, that's part of our problem in the 20th, 21st century. We simply see the world as our little thing that we can do whatever and push it to the limit. And if things go extinct, oh well. You know, if the plastic poisons the oceans and comes back at us, oh well. You probably, some of you I think have seen like the latest scientific research is not only is all the plastic going into the ocean being broken down into what's called microplastics that you would need a microscope to see, and that's being ingested by the fish. So when you go, buy fish at a restaurant, not only is it being broken down into microplastics, we know that, and they're from the top of the ocean column to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. You can find those microplastics. But now,
Is that the P5?
no, that's not PFAS, that's different. But now, those microplastics are being ground up by a microscopic organism that you may have remembered from biology called rotifers, R-O-T-I-F-E-R-S. And the rotifers are breaking them into nanoplastics, which are super, super small. And again, they're going to get into the food supply everywhere. So, you know, we have a lot of problems. And part of it, I think, is because compared to indigenous cultures, we don't see responsibility for our kin. And I think that's part of what this story was getting at. Like, if you're going to live the right way, you have to see these animals and this world as one community that we're part of. Other questions or comments?
Was Minerva supposed to be an all-powerful person? I mean, how did she catch Koschei in the start? In the beginning? She didn't have a power or something.
Are you saying, like, where does he come from?
Minerva. She captured Koschei without a power horse or anything. And it reminds me of a little bit about the Adam and Eve thing, where God told them, don't take the apple, and she told him, don't go into the room, and he went into the room, and this was all to teach him a lesson.
Yeah, so I thought about this story for the better part of 10 years, and it was only about in year 9 that I came to a realization that Bob just raised. So Bob, you're a lot faster than I am. Then I realized, like, wait a minute, she had Koschei imprisoned, which means there's a backstory to this story. And she knew exactly how to deal with him, but she was letting Mergen go on and do his own thing because he needs to learn.
And she stood by her man. So there's going
Yeah.
It was a prequel.
So my wife and I has a really important friendship with a Native American woman for 5 years until she suddenly passed away. And Sam, the month before she passed away, I was with her, and she said, Eric, I'm going to have to evict my son Paul because he's living in a house that I own. He's not paying any rent. He's not paying the bills. I'm not doing him any good by letting him live there for free, and I'm enabling bad behavior. And she was going to go back and tell him that, and evict him. And then a month later, she died. So I think she probably evicted him, but I'm not positive. But it was only recently, as I was working with the story, that I realized in her culture, in the Ojibwe culture, they have a belief, which probably this terminology comes from cultural anthropologists. I can't believe that Ojibwe people would say it in these terms. But the concept is this. They call it the law of non-interference. And the law of non-interference, again, that's the anthropologist way of saying it. But the law of non-interference, when you translate in Ojibwe culture, it goes this way. It's not my right to interfere with the decisions of another person as long as their decisions aren't causing serious harm to them or to another being. And in that being, they would include animals and so on. So unless that person's actions are causing serious harm to themselves or another being, I can't interfere. It's really tough for parents to do, by the way. Because, and Sam did say this to me, she said, I realize he's on his own path and I can't walk it for him. And so clearly in the story, Maravna has great powers, probably greater powers than Mergen, and yet she chooses not to use them, to let him walk his own path. Good observation, Bob.
But I wouldn't put it that way. He failed her test.
I don't understand the significance of the cleared path that led to her tent. There's that path of destruction that he had to ride down the side of to get there. Was that
Anybody understand what that was?
I would assume that.
Yeah.
Whatever he does.
And that was Koschei, not when he was just coming up off the floor after not, being free and he's weak. But this is when he's strong. When he's strong, he can level that forest because he is a powerful force of nature. You could say, if you go back to ancient times, and this is my interpretation, you go back to ancient times, people in places like Greece and Rome and other early civilizations believed that there were 4 ethers that made up everything, 4 substances: earth, water, air, fire. Baba Yaga, fire. Koschei, air. He's the whirlwind, the tornado. Mergen, land. Moravna, the daughter of the sea. She's water. But yeah, it's funny. I have to tell you, if you go back to the Russian story, he comes up over the rise on his horse, and in front of him is a battlefield, and the army is laying dead everywhere. Somebody has slain all these people. There's the tent at the end of the battlefield. Out walks Moravna. She's a warrior princess. She killed hundreds, thousands of people. To me, that's the Russian version. If you believe that this is an indigenous tale, indigenous people didn't have armies. They lived in hunter-gatherer villages. So I'm wrestling with, 2 years ago, roughly, I'm wrestling with, I don't know, what would they have seen? What would the indigenous people have seen? Oh my God! There was a big tornado that just came through Gloucester County. You go and look even today at the path of destruction, it just was a tunnel blasting its way through Gloucester County. I was like, that's what it was. Because there was already some elements in there to suggest that he was associated with the whirlwind.
That makes sense on the Russian steppes.
Yeah, it could, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? I've kept you way too long, I think.
Just something else to think about with the time to grow. Bill will be baking the bread and eating real cookies.
All right, if you have any questions, I'm here. There's food over here. Take a look at the paintings. Those are 4 of the 15 that will be in the book. Hopefully that'll be out by March.